Welcome to the first talk for this year for the Initiative for Individuals with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. This is, I believe, our 6th year. And so every year we have 3 to 4 speakers who come and talk on different topics relevant to understanding and individuals with varying disabilities and abilities. And we know already that our speakers in April are going to be focused on autism. It's Autism Awareness Month in April, and so we have Gary Stobie lined up, who works with adolescents with autism, and also Annette Estes, who's worked with the early intervention. So we're going to do both ends of the lifespan a little bit there, you know, from early childhood through adulthood, because Gary talks about that transition to adulthood for individuals, especially on the autism spectrum. So tonight we have the pleasure of having Dr. Tracy Jirikowic with us, and we've had her once before, and it was like this, a really good turnout. People very enthusiastic about what she has to share. I'll let you read about her degrees and everything on the postcards. I don't think I need to go over that again, but she's doing some really exciting research with individuals with FASD on that spectrum, and trying to help us, I think, understand how we can really promote their functioning in these different settings. And I'm very happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. And I have the sense that there are clinical psychology students and then special education students. Are there other folks out here that? Parents. Okay, great. Parents. That was my next question. Other professionals?
I'm a director of a child care center.
Okay, great. All right. I just want to say that I'm, as you know, an occupational therapist, but I appreciate the opportunity to have a dialogue with other professional disciplines and parents too, and other, again, providers in the community, because I worked very closely with psychologists. I've worked in the schools, so, you know, working with special education teachers and you know, problem solving in regards to children's behaviors and supports for children. It's such an important process, and it's really a team approach in my experience that is so critical and important. So I really, again, appreciate that you're here to hear some of the perspectives of what occupational therapy brings to the table. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay, I can move that up if that helps.
I should mention that we will post this lecture on the YouTube for the university along with the slides, so that should be in a couple weeks.
So what I'd like to do tonight, I'd like to cover 3 primary objectives, and I want to talk to you about how sensory processing disorders are identified. We'll start with a few definitions, but then kind of really cut to the chase and talk about, well, how do we identify these behaviors in children? And then think about, if a child does have sensory processing issues, how does that impact them in day-to-day activities and their ability to participate at home, in school, in the community? And I think the majority of the presentation will then just focus on different kinds of intervention strategies and supports, as well as some resources. And you know, I'm going to pause for questions midway and then have time for questions at the end. But you know, within this group, I'm hoping that there will be some questions so we can have some dialogue. And I'm veering away a little bit from some of the research that is, you know, behind some of the sensory integration. I'm just focusing later in terms of some of the more community-based interventions, I think, that I think are exciting and that we've been focusing on and that are emerging and with emerging research. So we're all on the same page. I just wanted to briefly define what I mean by sensory processing, and you're probably going to hear 2 terms. You're going to hear sensory processing and sensory integration, and I'm going to use the 2 terms sort of synonymously. But really what this is, it's the brain's ability to efficiently receive, organize, interpret, and use information from the sensory systems and generate an adaptive behavioral response. So basically, taking in information and matching a response that's appropriate for the demand or the environment at any given time. So it's a neurobehavioral process, and it's really that capacity to attend to what is meaningful and then filter and ignore what is irrelevant. So when we do this, our behavior is much more organized. We can regulate our emotions and behavior better, and also interact successfully with the physical and social environment. And this is an important capacity across the lifespan, from infants through childhood, through adulthood. And so when we think about, we're talking about the neurobehavioral process, so what's kind of going on in the brain, we also have sort of a conceptual framework that really, in the late 1960s, early 70s, there was an occupational therapist who was working with children with learning disabilities, and she really began to notice these behaviors, and she basically pioneered the theory of sensory integration. So what she did was link this relationship between sensation, brain function, and observable behavior. And so this really set the stage for, again, understanding or thinking about inferences in relation to this neurobehavioral process. And then from that, she generated ideas and theories about therapeutic techniques that use sensation or consider a child's sensory needs that support arousal regulation, emotion, sensory motor development, and then the ultimate goal of day-to-day function. And so when we think about sensation, it's really something that is pervasive in our day-to-day lives. And so when we think about, again, what purpose do our sensory systems serve, they're really to protect and inform us. So at that level of protection, our sensory systems are there so that we notice novelty and something that might be different. And this is related to that fight or flight response at times. So again, accompanied with some of these responses, we get that neurophysiological arousal reaction that again can kind of heighten our senses even further and kind of set our physiology on high guard, so to speak. On the other end, our sensory systems help us discriminate detail and serve to inform us. So there's that idea, again, if we're putting our hands and reaching into our pocket and feeling for a quarter or a penny or a dime, we can use our sense of touch and tactile discrimination. And so we understand what that coin might be without having to look at it, because we have good feedback and good discrimination from our senses. So like any other system within our body, some things may not always operate smoothly, or there is the possibility for impairment. And so when we talk about sensory processing disorders in a moment, this is the idea that, again, our sensory systems, things may go wrong, or it may not be operating as smoothly as it should be. Another thing we need to think about in terms of sensation is that it's always interesting when I talk to occupational therapy students, but as well other parents or other disciplines through my day-to-day work or other kinds of presentations, people sort of learn things about themselves. And once we start talking about sensation, people kind of have these aha moments, and they understand that there's a lot of sensory preferences that we have as individuals that drive our own behaviors and habits. So some of us, again, many of you are students. Some of you might need very quiet, very low stimulation types of environments, and that's how you operate better. And others, loud music and a lot of activity, that is the kind of condition or environment that you might thrive in and do well in. So that's just an example, again, of how from one person to another, how they function, how they operate based on sort of the sensory surroundings can be very different. And also what we think about is that as we go through our daily routines and other leisure activities, for example, we tend to avoid maybe what is aversive to us, perhaps from a sensory perspective, and really seek what might feel nice to us, or what maybe relaxes us or makes us feel comfortable. And then I always think of the what we could call sensation seekers, who might be skydiving and doing some of these really thrilling extreme sports, and my sensory system is quite different than that, but you can maybe start seeing that there's a real maybe sensory drive also for some of these behaviors. So and again, how we respond to sensation, and then how we use regulatory and coping strategies, it's all highly variable. But I think often as adults we have some self-awareness about sort of maybe what types of sensation may be less comfortable or irritable, and what might be more pleasurable. And we have, with that self-awareness, often comes that capacity to regulate our behavior or try to control that in our lives. And so what we will be thinking about is, children with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they may really lack that self-awareness to understand that, if they're bothered by loud sounds, it might be the radio, and they could get up and turn it off. And so they might not have that awareness that, oh, it's that sound that's really bothering me, and then not have that power or control or that awareness to then make that change. So I think that's a nice analogy to kind of again think about where we're going with this information, and how children, by virtue of being younger and less mature, might lack some of that self-awareness. And then on top of that, children who have maybe some cognitive or some other kinds of behavioral or regulatory challenges, how that becomes even harder to do. So what is a sensory processing disorder? Again, it's also, you might have heard the term sensory integration dysfunction. It's within our field, these two terms are used, and some people are now using sensory processing disorder more than others, but both terms are still used. And it's really this group of neurobehavioral problems that are thought to be related to subtle neural differences that involve multisensory and motor systems. So it's not always just motor, but it also may manifest as some difficulties with motor abilities. And I really like this term. It's from the Sensory Processing Disorder Foundation. It's really like a neurological traffic jam. So parts of the brain do not get the information needed to interpret sensory information correctly. And I think one very important word here is brain-based. This is a neurological difference. And so what we'll get at also is that when you think about behavior challenges, it helps you reframe something that may be an undesirable behavior and look at it as a neurological difference rather than a willful behavior. So I think sometimes that can really help and have a powerful impact. So what do we know about sensory processing disorder? We know that a lot of occupational therapy researchers and some neuroscience researchers are working really hard to pinpoint some of the neurological processes and understand the etiology better. But as of now and currently, there still isn't a specific neural mechanism that has been identified as the cause. And really what it assumes is that there's normal sensory reception at the peripheral level. So this would not be, if somebody has a vision impairment, that they have low vision or are blind, for example, that type of sensory disorder, that would not be sensory processing or sensory integration. That would be a primary visual impairment. This assumes that, again, most of these systems, that information is coming in, but it's somewhere in the central nervous system in the brain where that traffic jam occurs. Again, that's that central part of the brain is where the information must be integrated and interpreted and organized. And when you think about the complexity and how much sensation we get on a day, in any given moment, as you're sitting here now, to pay attention to me, you're really, tuning out some of the light, tuning out some of the background sounds. You're probably have very limited awareness of how your clothes feel on your body or how your body feels in the chair unless you start moving around. That might, again, if you've been sitting too long, then you sort of, your attention goes elsewhere. But it gives you that example of how, your nervous system is really tuning out a lot so that you're focusing on what's relevant in the moment. And so I think this is where the interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary dialogue becomes really important, because if you look at sensory processing system symptoms on the surface, poor behavior regulation, emotional reactivity, aggressive behavior, avoidance or shutting down, inattention, distractibility, or clumsiness or incoordination. If I probably asked several of you, you'd probably have some different reasons as to why you might see those behaviors or different explanations. And I think what the sensory processing framework brings is that it gives you another perspective on what might be causing some of those behavioral difficulties. And I'll be the first one to say that sensory can be just one part of the equation, and it does not explain all of those behaviors by any means. And that is why that dialogue is really important, because a communication problem or a cognitive issue could also lead to many of those kinds of behaviors on the surface. But what we do with sensory processing is, again, we think about sensation, and we see that there might be some more specific symptoms sort of at the next layer. So we might see that they're upset during grooming activities, toothbrushing and bathing. When you think about toothbrushing and bathing and start thinking about all this sensory processing that goes on, toothbrushing, you've got something in your mouth, a very sensitive area. You might have toothpaste that has a very strong flavor. You might have cold water, and again, bristles that might not or might be highly stimulating. There's a lot of sensory input going on, and that's an area that often is difficult. And bathing, again, can be a very sensory kind of activity of daily living. Doesn't like the feel of certain clothes, so there's a lot of different feel to fabrics and how that might feel on somebody's skin. Being a picky eater, frightened or bothered by loud noises. And then what we call some sensory seeking kind of behaviors, where they're jumping into objects or crushing their body as if they just, they really need some more input. Always moving or touching, so they're kind of craving all this input. Their nervous system needs more. Breaking things by pressing or pushing too hard. So again, thinking about your sense of touch discrimination, that a child who doesn't have a good touch discrimination doesn't know sometimes how light or how heavy to push, and they can't grade their movements very well. And then difficulty learning new motor skills. So there's a little bit of cognition there, but there's this idea that if you have a good sense of where your body is in space, that learning new motor skills can be easier. But if you don't have a good sense, you have to think harder about where your body is and where your position is to learn those new motor skills. So these are the kinds of symptoms and some of the kind of activities that we try to focus in on to understand, are these behaviors related to sensory? Are they related to something else? Or are they related to sensory and some of these other things too? That can certainly be the case. And I just want to point out, so we think about, there are folks trying to do different subtypes of sensory processing disorder, and I'm not going to go into that, but understand that there's different types of sensory responsiveness, and then also there's these sensory-based motor disorders, so the ones that I just sort of talked about. But we're going to focus more on the arousal, regulation, behavior, and think about there's sort of a continuum of sensory responsivity. So ideally, we're in this sort of middle area. We're in this level of optimal arousal, which is that state of readiness for learning, and that's pretty wide. And people can move in and out of that, But where we see a sensory processing disorder is we see kids sort of landing on each end of those continuum more so than not. And so we see kids who are undersensitive to sensation, so maybe they don't notice sensation as easily, or they're under aroused, and those might be those kids who are seeking more sensory information to kind of, wake up their nervous system, so to speak. And then we have on the other end hyper-responsivity. So these are the kids that, or individuals that might be oversensitive. So this is where sensory stimulation or certain kinds of sensation feels painful or threatening, and really puts kids into that fight or flight response, so that high level of arousal, and their behavior becomes disorganized. And so, again, I think as somebody coming from the discipline of occupational therapy, this is something that is part of our clinical training from the get-go. And it's one of the most heavily researched areas of occupational therapy, and one area that people are trying to do is understand these neural correlates. And so you might know that there was an attempt to get the sensory processing disorder into the DSM-5, but it didn't, that did not work out. But we have, again, a growing body of research, some excellent collaboration between therapists and neuroscientists, I believe, where we do see kids who have these behaviors. They have different physiological stress responses to sensations, so the magnitude of their response is typically greater to discrete sensory stimulation, and then their response may be longer, so they tend to not habituate and get used to it, and it's harder for them to sort of calm down. And then there's some people also doing other kinds of studies where they're finding that differences in how their brains filter or get used to repeated sensation, again, related to the habituation or sensory gating. So I think what this research is saying is that, again, these differences are real. They're not just behavioral. There's some underlying neurological mechanisms that warrant more attention and research, and explain some of these. And sensory processing, it does not only occur in children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It occurs in about 5 to 15% of the general population. Excuse me. And typically those would be individuals who don't have another co-occurring kind of condition. And then we have a lot of different research studies that have tried to document these behaviors in children with all different kinds of developmental disabilities. And we see prevalence rates of about 40 to as high as 80%. So these behaviors, we have seen them described in children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, very common in autism. The research that I do is in fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, so we've clearly documented these in that population, Fragile X syndrome, and other kinds of learning disabilities. So again, these sensory processing differences really do commonly occur with a wide range of children with other kinds of developmental disabilities. So I want to speak now about how sensory processing problems are identified. So again, this is another area within our field of occupational therapy that continues to evolve, and there are multiple ways we do this. Occupational therapists, again, historically, because this is where this framework and some of these ideas originated, we are typically trained from, as part of our professional training at the beginning. We are trained to identify and treat sensory processing disorders, but many people do kind of, do a lot of continuing education and really focus on some of these treatment strategies and intervention strategies in more depth. So there's, again, a kind of a continuum of expertise in relation to occupational therapy providers in this area. But we can look at these behaviors in young children, birth to 3 and early intervention programs. We can look at them within the school and then clinical settings. So these are places where children may go to be evaluated. And when we think about the evaluation focus and the process, we're looking at similar things more or less across these different ages, but we're just developmentally adjusting some of those expectations and where we might consider something to be a difference or an impairment. And again, when you think about some of these behaviors in a 2-year-old, for example, there's a lot of these behaviors that might, being a picky eater might be just part of that developmental repertoire of a 2-year-old. But we might look further and we might be more concerned when we see some of these behaviors that persist beyond that particular developmental stage. And so one primary way we evaluate these sensory processing behaviors is we use standardized questionnaires and behavioral checklists that are basically rating the frequency of different kinds of behavioral responses. So, the symptoms I listed, expresses distress during grooming or have, difficulty during bathing. Those are the kinds of symptoms that, parents are rating on this checklist. And 2 common checklists are the sensory profile and the sensory processing measure. And as you can see, we have kind of separate checklists for younger children, infant and toddlers, and then some tools for adolescents and adults. And I'll have to say that, again, that's another area that continues to evolve and move forward, is that there are folks working at identifying and understanding how sensory processing disorders manifest in adults. So we're honing tools in that area. And then what I want to say about the sensory processing measure, again, it's another tool, similar checklist, rating behavior, but it brings forth the importance of context and environment and how sensory behaviors, they can change. Context can affect how children respond, and within the sensory processing measure, you have the opportunity to rate behaviors in the cafeteria, for example, or on the bus. So there's, again, different expectations and there's different kinds of stimulation. And what we see, I think, with sensory processing disorder is that, again, you might see a behavior in school, but maybe you don't see it at home, or you might see some of this behavior at home, but not at school. So you have to look kind of broadly at these issues. There are some standardized performance-based tests, and there's one gold standard that is often used related to sensory integration, the sensory integration and practices test, which allows one to get some of the sensory-based motor disorders a little bit more, and a lot of the checklists, those really gravitate towards some of the sensory modulation and some of the kind of behavioral difficulties. In the sensory integration and praxis test, you'll get to see maybe how some of the sensory issues are affecting some of the touch discrimination more specifically, or some of the motor planning that I talked about earlier. And then the other really important piece, it's not standardized, it's not there's not one way to do this, but it would be informed clinical observation. So there's ways to look at, we would be looking at structured observations of movement, but also just watching children in their natural settings. So how are they playing, how are they interacting, and what's their behavior like in these different settings, and trying to understand more about how sensory issues might be impacting them in these day-to-day kinds of activities and in these different settings. So what evaluation really serves to do is we think about how these behavioral responses sort of manifest across sensory systems. So we look at visual behaviors, we look at how they respond to sound, we look at taste and smell, and then how they respond to different kind of demands related to tactile stimulation. And then I always, like to add, again, vestibular movement, that's a really important sense, and proprioception, so this body sense, body awareness, and pressure from the muscles and joints. And those are what some people call more body-centered senses, and those are really very integral to some of this theory and some of the intervention strategies. So we're looking at how they respond, again, that over-responsivity or under-responsivity across those specific kinds of sensory stimuli. And then, again, trying to identify these response patterns. So within that continuum, as I mentioned, do they fall on either end, too responsive, or not noticing, not responsive enough? Do they have some sensation-seeking tendencies? Is it they're always on the go and they can't seem to, satisfy that need for sensation? Or do we see a lot of ups and downs? And as you may guess, we do see a lot of ups and downs, and we see variability, from one sensory system to another, and even within the same sensory system. So I think as we learn about sensation and sensory processing more, and try to categorize children into these patterns, I think we're understanding that a lot of times, what we see is this variability, and we kind of get a mix of these different behaviors, which kind of can make it hard to figure these children out, but it brings forth the reason that you have to do some careful observation, you have to think hard and do some detective work oftentimes. And I would just say something, again, a really important purpose of the evaluation, again, is to sort out the sensory, or what seems to be sensory, from the other problems that might be occurring in that child's development. And then here's the when and where problems occur. So as OTs, one thing that we really care about is, that people can get through their daily routines, bathing, toileting, going to bed, getting through school. That's just something that we think about, and we evaluate, and we treat people who have those kinds of difficulties. And so we really care about context and function. And so, we are looking for these behaviors, but we're looking for them as they affect function, because you could have some sensory processing differences and you may be coping adequately, or they may not be impacting what you do and how you do. And so these are some of the areas, again, where we might see some of these behaviors crop up a little bit more, and it's really because some of the sensory demands or the regulatory demands of those activities are higher. So toothbrushing we talked about, dressing we kind of talked about, bedtime when kids are trying to sort of calm down and go to sleep and get into that other kind of level of arousal, kids have a hard time winding down. We think about the community, and as our world continues to get more fast-paced and where we have images and sounds coming at us all the time, being in the community, grocery shopping, running errands, or riding in the car, those can be really taxing kinds of activities. The school, as I mentioned before, these different environments, the bus can have a lot of different kinds of sensory stimuli related to movement, and the cafeteria, sounds, smells, etc., a lot of activity going on. And different classrooms have different sensory demands or loads. And then we think about transitions. So, there's certain times of day that kids may just be a little more vulnerable if they've held it together all day at school, and then they come home and there's some smaller demands, but boy, that's when the meltdowns occur. It can just be sort of a cumulative effect, so that transition might be difficult. And then just the novelty, a new situation, our nervous system, we're wired to tune into novelty a little bit more, so we all naturally, again, our arousal is heightened, and we pay attention to more when we're in those new situations. And when we think about, again, for children, that might be another sort of context where if you have some sensory vulnerabilities or sensory sensitivities, those situations can be harder. So as I said before, the context really matters. So these sensory behaviors, they can vary in different contexts and situations, and that we really care if these difficulties are having an impact on function, and sort of, again, doing problem solving around that, because it's not always readily obvious that there might be sensory contributions to these difficulties, but it's part of that sort of problem-solving process that can add another perspective, or that, okay, we do need to think about this sensory issue affecting attention before we can get them to learn. So I just wanted to pause a little bit. Are there any questions about what a sensory processing disorder is, or how sensory processing disorders are identified? That was sort of the focus of the first part. Yes? Mm-hmm.
So you talked about sorting out sensory problems from what may not be really sensory problems. Can you give an example of what might seem like sensory but isn't really?
So can you repeat? So if there's a behavior and it might.
So you had a slide that said sort out sensory issues from non-sensory issues.
Yeah.
So
that.
you're talking about where a behavior might seem sensory related, but isn't? Is that what you meant?
I guess you could think of a more general behavior like, let's see, withdrawal from a situation. So in a classroom, a child might withdraw because it's too much stimulation. Maybe they might withdraw because cognitively the demands are too high. Maybe they're withdrawing because they've got some mental health issues, and they just socially don't want to be around other kids. So that is what I meant about sorting it out. So there could be a lot of different explanations for some of those behaviors that you're worried about. Okay. One more question?
Impact on function. What's an example of that?
Well, that would be that, say, a child's very sensitive to noise, and noise is very distracting, so they're in a room and there's a lot going on, they can't focus and get their homework done. There are kids who have they're very hypersensitive to loud noises, and like a fire drill at school is just really very difficult, and it can really set the child off, and they get into that state of over arousal, and then maybe the rest of the day they're off because that was too much for them. So that would be an example of that. So, and one more.
Can I just give another example?
Yes, please.
I had a child that was so sensitive to clothing that literally we struggled to get clothes on him to even get him out into society. So even impacting literally dress and being able to function to come out.
Yeah.
He was so sensitive to anything against his body.
Yes.
So it can be highly impactful.
Yes, thank you. Or that nobody can touch their hair or go to the dentist, for example. That's a big deal because they're so sensitive around their mouth. So yeah, there's lots of examples. So okay, so now I'll probably try to spend the next portion of the presentation tonight on intervention. And what I have here is the continuum of intervention approaches that I think as an occupational therapist we might take. We might take one or more or all of these approaches to intervention. And I'm going to talk a little bit about clinical intervention, but focus more on how, so we can problem solve and think about how you can modify environments, modify routines and activities, and sort of teach coping skills with sensory needs in mind. So why consider sensory-based interventions? As I mentioned before, sensation does have a powerful impact on the brain, and so knowing how a child reacts to sensation and being aware of the sensory load of a task or environment can really help us understand and reframe some behaviors and then guide intervention. And I put up this model. It's the International Classification of Disability and Function. And this is a model that we use a lot in rehabilitation. And so what it, I think, does is it highlights that we're thinking about sensory processing as a challenge or a problem with body functions and body structure, but the activity can sort of magnify that problem, or it can sort of, if you have some coping skills and strategies and the activity is the right match, you may not see as much of a manifestation of the difficulty. And we care about participation, so how does that disability, again, affect what somebody wants to do in their day-to-day lives? And then we have the environmental factors, and so again, I like to, the analogy here, sensory processing is more or less an invisible disability. And so, we think about a physical disability, somebody who uses a wheelchair. If there are no environmental barriers, if there's ramps, etc., then whatever impairment they might have, it really may not be a disability. But when you come up across a barrier, somebody can't get in a building or can't move a certain way because of they don't have a mobility aid, then you really can see how an environmental factor can impact somebody's function and ability to participate. So, with the sensory processing, it's not as clear-cut, again, because it's an invisible disability, but when we think about environment and when we think about how we could possibly, change the environment and not only expect the child to change, we sort of open up these possibilities, and the impact of the impairment as a disability may be lessened. So, and so the other thing to think about, again, this is a framework that as occupational therapists we often use, and sort of another way to illustrate that relationship and how you can problem solve is that we've got child factors, and so their sensory thresholds or their responses, so where they are in that continuum. And then we have the demands of the task. So we're thinking about, again, the example of dressing. There's a lot of touch stimulation involved with dressing. So again, you can think about once you start looking for sensory demands within any task, you can see how a specific activity may be more or less taxing for an individual. And then we think about, again, the physical environment, so the surroundings, sounds, sights, activities that might be going on around the child, and then the social environment too. So there's a little bit of, the people within the environment, but also some of the social expectations that can add up, and again, sort of come together and either magnify or lessen the activity or the task that needs to be done. And the other thing is we need to be thinking about is, we need to be realistic, because when we start talking about the environment, or we talk about the child and what we think we can change or what we can't change, there are situations where it's not going to be an option to change the environment. So that in that case, again, you have to think about another way to work around that. So it's that realistic perspective. As an OT, I always think about going into a classroom, and teacher has a routine and a strategy, and some other kinds of setup in their environment. And there's some things that can be changed, but there's just other logistics that you can't ask somebody to do that, or it's just not appropriate to make those kinds of recommendations. So you have to work around it. So one, I think, very powerful intervention is just by virtue of identifying sensory processing problems, you are getting some kind of education about the cause or a possible cause of a behavior. So, these are some quotes about being oversensitive to touch or tactile defensiveness. So until somebody knew about what tactile defensiveness was, and that a child could go into sort of that aggressive response just because they're alarmed by unexpected touch, suddenly that explains some kind of playground attacks or some aggressive behavior on the playground. It may not be willful aggression, it may be more of a protective kind of response. And poor body awareness explains how he kept knocking over glasses of juice and unintentionally bumping into kids when running across the playground. So again, not intentionally pushing or shoving, it's like I just can't keep track of my body in space, and I have very, very poor awareness of how close I am and how to control my body around other kids. So the next intervention approach would be some direct clinical intervention, and this would be occupational therapy using sensory integration approaches. And so what you've seen, there's air sensory integration. That is, I think it's a trademarked approach because again, it's sort of clarifying that this is one specific, more intensive therapeutic approach to treating these children. And Jane Ayers was the occupational therapist who pioneered the theory, and so thusly named after her. And again, this is very individualized, intensive clinical intervention, and so sensation is used to build the child's capacity to function. And I'm just going to show you what that looks like. I think many of you probably have seen a therapy gym and may be wondering what's going on, but I think this video will explain a little bit more clearly what that approach is about. And just to comment on the question that was asked about function too, I think you heard some of the outcomes that were really meaningful for that family. So just family interactions were impaired by this problem, and there's actually the earlier part of the clip, which I didn't show. You can see how they have Tanner filmed in a restaurant, and what a disaster that restaurant outing was, and then also mom trying to comb his hair and put his socks on, and he's just getting so mad and angry, and so you can see that, and I can always provide that link so you could go watch that in its entirety. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the clinical intervention, so you have an idea of how the sensation might be used therapeutically, what the environment, the sensory or clinical environment might look like, and how they're trying to really expose children to these different kinds of sensory experiences, but using sensation in a very therapeutic way by understanding some of the properties sensation has and how that affects the nervous system. And I'll speak a little bit more to that as I talk about sensory-based interventions. So within occupational therapy, again, there's these sort of components of intervention that fall under sensory integration or sensory processing. So I'm trying to maybe clarify them so that if you've had some questions, you can more clearly understand some of the distinctions and maybe some of the strengths or limitations of each approach. And so sensory-based tools and strategies or protocols, they're really aimed at supporting sensory modulation, arousal, and attention. And so the idea is that these tools help achieve a regulatory state of readiness as a foundation for learning and participation. So these are some strategies. You don't obviously have a clinic like that in a school, but these would be strategies that you might give to the child or the child's teacher so that they can, again, be more focused or alert or attentive in the classroom. And really what this is based on is that different types of sensation typically impact the nervous system and regulatory state. It's a generalization, but there's some properties that have more calming and inhibitory techniques, and then other kinds of sensation that are more alerting or excitatory. So what we typically would do then is come up with what some people call a sensory diet, and so it's a menu of these sensory activities and tools that become embedded into a child's classroom routine or the morning routine. And as you can imagine, there isn't one set protocol because individual needs are so different, but you're kind of building these activities around the child's sensory needs and profile, sort of the environment that you're in, and the task that needs to be done. So they're basically regulatory strategies, but they have these strong sensory motor components, and they're very rich in these body-centered sensations, so movement, that's a big one. And then proprioception, we also call heavy work, so where you're activating the joints and pushing and pulling, has this inhibitory effect on the nervous system, and touch. And these are powerful behavior regulators and really, again, serve the purpose of trying to, when you saw that arrow, that continuum, bringing those kids who are on sort of each end more towards the middle so that they're in that more optimal level of arousal and regulatory state. And so if you Google sensory diet, or some of you have maybe resources and books, you'll see pages and pages of different kinds of activities. So there's endless possibilities about, you know, the kind of sensory tools you could use. And what I've done here is just outline some basic strategies. And what I think as you tune into this more, or you adopt some of these strategies, you become good observers and you kind of become skilled at matching. But I think, again, that occupational therapy piece where there's that more depth of understanding of what sensation can do for an individual, that's an important part of a consultation process, for example. And it also, with some of these tools, there might be specific protocols or maybe some safety issues. I mean, again, some of these things you can go on the internet and you can look and you can purchase an air cushion, or you can purchase a weighted blanket. These are all available, but my message is that you have to be very cautious, because some of these can be very powerful on the nervous system, and there could be some safety risks or some protocols, if they're not followed, that they may not be effective, or they may stray from the intention of the actual protocol from the beginning. But here are some more general kinds of principles and ideas to think about. So movement, it's something that we all can do, and it is a powerful regulator. And when we think about children who have sensory needs, a lot of time what we call heavy work, pushing and pulling activities, a tug of war. You might have seen wall push-ups, yoga poses where you're activating those muscles, and either moving or in more static poses where you're activating those muscles. Again, those can be sort of more calming and organizing. Slow, linear swinging or rocking, that is a kind of movement that can be more calming. You can think about a lot of these strategies might be used with babies, and so they can't regulate themselves, so parents do that for them. And so kids with sensory processing issues, they are not developing in that area, so they need more help. And so providing rocking in another way that might be more developmentally appropriate would still maybe serve that purpose of helping that child calm down to go to sleep or calm down to focus. So I like to kind of bring forth some of those examples about young children, because I think it sort of demystifies some of the I think the reputation that this is an alternative approach or an alternative intervention. A lot of these are strategies that people have already used in some respect at different developmental time points. Movement breaks like recess, fast swinging, rotational movement, slides, that kind of movement or vestibular input can be more alerting. With touch, fidgets can be organizing and calming. So fidgets would be, koosh balls or some kind of, beanbag that a child can hold in their hand and kind of hold on to. I think as adults, a lot of us might do that, with a pencil or with a rubber band or something like that. So again, we sort of use those strategies too, but it might help the child who has that need to touch kind of stay focused and keep his or her hands to himself. When we think about touch, there's two types. There's more of a deep pressure touch, like a massage, which is more calming and organizing, or we have light touch or a tickle that is more alerting. So some strategies to help organize and calm that would involve deep pressure touch would be some of the, like a weighted lap pad or a beanbag chair or a body pillow, when you think about how it can kind of envelop a child or kind of give them a snuggle or a hug. That is sort of that deep pressure input that can help children kind of focus and organize. And sound, so reducing sound from the environment, so noise canceling headphones might be one way to do that. White noise or rhythmical music or music at or sound at a low volume, those might be more calming or organizing kinds of input, whereas loud or upbeat music would be more stimulating and more alerting. Sort of visual sensory tools, a study carrel might help reduce visual stimuli for a particular child. Lower lights or natural lighting as opposed to like fluorescent lighting can be more calming and easier on the nervous system, as would be kind of lighter or more muted colors. And then sort of on the contrast, bright lights, bright colors, or lots of movement or busy environments, those would be more alerting kinds of input. And it's always interesting because, again, this is where the individual differences come in. As I was trying to organize these into nice little categories, somebody could easily say that, the fidgets might be more of an alerting stimuli. And absolutely, for some people, that might be the purpose. So it's, again, finding, these are some general ideas and some general sensory sort of characteristics and how they might act on the nervous system, but any one person might use the same kind of sensation or the same activity, but it might be, a calming, organizing input for one, and it might be more alerting for another. So it doesn't always fit so nicely in little boxes, and that variability and again, individuality of how you might choose and present some of these interventions or tools, that's really important to understand. And so, again, observing behavior and, kind of being vigilant and cognitive, is this tool having the effect that we are hoping it has? And if it's not, that might not be the right match. So here's where I'd like to talk a little bit about a problem-solving strategy. And so where we're thinking about, here's a task, and what is it about the child or the environment or the features of the task that that might be posing the problem, and then how do we intervene? So a simple example would be dressing. And so we think about dressing, and we have a child who has a lot of tactile sensitivity or touch sensitivity. We understand, and we've talked about that dressing is the sensory load or the tactile load can be pretty high. There's a lot of input that would be put on the skin, and anything moving against the skin too, pulling socks on or off and putting shirts on or off, that can impact that sensory input. We get dressed every day. We probably don't think about that sensory load, but for the child that you mentioned that can't even get out of the house because they can't tolerate clothes on their body, that's why it's too much. It doesn't feel good. It's uncomfortable. It might be painful. It's like when we have that tag or that little part of our sock that isn't quite right, that's happening all the time for some of these kids. And maybe they're getting dressed in the middle of the living room, and because mom's in the kitchen and they can't dress independently in the bedroom, but then the TV's on, kind of blaring because dad wants to watch the news. So you kind of look at that situation and go, okay, with the sensory needs in mind, what can you do? Maybe you do realize it's a tactile issue, and the child, you just have to respect those clothing preferences. So they're not going to wear jeans. They will be wearing, lycra all the time, or leggings all the time. I know that sometimes a lot of kids won't wear the jeans, or they want something that's tighter fitting. The loose, clothing rubs or moves against the skin more, so there's more of a probability that they're getting some more constant input from that. Maybe you cut out the tags of the clothes, or you can buy the seamless socks. And in case you haven't noticed, I know if some of you have young children or school-age kids, that a lot of clothes don't have tags anymore. They just have the stamp. So maybe some of that problem is going away. But again, that's probably a good thing that some of these things are shifting. Whether or not it was because of children's sensory differences or another reason, I don't know, but maybe it doesn't matter. So that's one way to approach this. The other one is to, is it possible to change the environment, to reduce the sound, or to turn the TV off? That would be up to the family to decide, but it's a suggestion that that, again, there's that cumulative load of all that stuff going on. So, that's a decision to make. Or, maybe not. Maybe that, has to happen there because of the supervision and people getting out the door in the morning. But again, that gives you some idea about different ways you can approach this problem. And the problem being, we can't get out the door in the morning because Susie won't get dressed. And here are some ways to problem solve that. Grocery shopping, I think I'll raise my hand, and I had those moments where we've had meltdowns in the middle of a place that you don't want to have a meltdown, and you've had to cut short your routine because maybe your grocery shopping is, errand number 3, and by that time, everybody's just done. But it's because of the sensory load of maybe going into Target or going into a grocery store. There's so much stimulation. There's bright lights. There's now there's walls of TV. They might be smells from food, or it might be very very warm or very cold depending on where you're moving. So there's a lot of sensory input, but also sensory change to tolerate. And so that might be a very difficult place for a child with sensory processing needs. And so then the problem solving that you're thinking about, okay, you've got a child who's very sensitive to sound and very sensitive to too much visual stimulation. You've got a busy environment, and you've got this task of grocery shopping that you need to do. So what's realistic in that situation? You have some options. You could, keep the child home because it is a very difficult environment. Maybe that means somebody needs to get a babysitter. So maybe that's not a feasible option for a single parent. Maybe you try to go at, 7 or 8 on a Saturday morning before everybody else gets up, instead of, 12 or 1 o'clock that day when it's a lot busier. So that might be a more feasible kind of change in routine. Maybe you put the child in the shopping cart and you have a nice little weighted lap pad or something, and you put that on over their lap while they're in the grocery cart, and that's that more calming kind of input that might be helpful. Does anybody have any other thoughts? Just curious. Yes?
You could go to a different store.
Right, absolutely.
Maybe a smaller, sweeter store.
Yeah.
More expensive.
Right, there's the trade-off. But again, I think what you're doing here is you're identifying the sensory issue and identifying how challenging that environment can be, and you're providing options, and you're trying to problem solve with that individual or that parent what's going to work or what's not. And so bringing forth those options is, I think, really important. Or you might advise that that's the one errand you do, that there's so much stimulation that it just, if at all possible, you just do that, and you don't try to do 3 or 4 things all in a row, or do that at the end of 3 of 3. So those are some changes in routines. Again, that doesn't necessarily require specialized therapeutic equipment or anything. It's just that that shift in how and the order or the way somebody's doing something. And I put school transition down there too, just to talk a little bit about the school. But you think about a child who might be a little younger, preschool, first or second grade, and maybe that coming into the classroom, a lot of kids are coming in all at once. Everybody's shuffling their book bags, taking their coats off. They're maybe in one little corner of the classroom, so they're kind of bumping into each other in close quarters. And so you can see why maybe that particular situation might be hard for a child with sensory issues because of that proximity, because of all that shuffling and potential kind of unexpected tactile input. Maybe you can't change the place in the classroom or how many kids are coming in at once, but maybe what you do is you work out an accommodation in that situation where the child is able to come to school 5 minutes early, or likewise they can leave 5 minutes later. That may not always be a feasible option, but again, it would circumvent that requirement to be in the middle of all the kids and all of the movement and activity at the beginning of the day. So that would be an example of how, again, you could accommodate or change that situation or routine. And so the other thought here, again, so the next part of I think the next 10 minutes, I want to kind of shift your thinking. How many of you have heard of universal design or inclusive programming? So this is a little bit of, universal design principles. So if you change your expectation and you sort of change the activity up front, you may not have to deal with the sensory issues, or you're just setting up the child for success in a different way. And the American Occupational Therapy Association is really, again, this is really important in terms of what they're trying to do. Is they're looking at a lot of these routines and activities that people do or that we do with kids, and so instead of having to accommodate a child who's having a meltdown in the car after they've been trick-or-treating and their costume is in their face and itchy. I passed one of those children a couple weeks ago. Not happy. Mom was not happy either. But what you're doing is you're just sort of redesigning the whole process. So you're kind of thinking about, what can that child do that won't be so taxing on their sensory system. You just, do it in a smaller group, or, instead of carving a pumpkin where they have to touch something sticky, you're just drawing on the, jack-o'-lantern. They're still participating, they're still doing something meaningful. You're just changing it a little bit to avoid some of the challenge. So, again, is there a recipe for this? Absolutely not. This is where your creativity sort of comes in and your problem solving. And then I think it's this recognition of some of these signals, behavioral signals of escalation. So that's the other piece, is that you're looking closely and watching for, I can see that there's that behavior kind of going up. We need to stop, and if you can, just pulling back and saying that's okay and move on. So changing your expectations of that particular, duration of that activity. But this is something that's on the AOTA website. So the other thing then, this is being applied to different community environments, so creating more sensory-friendly spaces, activities, and events. So performing arts, movie theaters, and museum and other public spaces are doing this. Some of you have, how many of you have seen sensory-friendly autism events or sensory-friendly? Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. And so this is about the education, maybe changing the environment and changing the expectations. So if you look online, you'll find autism-friendly or sensory-friendly activities. They're doing this in movie theaters. So turning the volume down a little bit, letting people get up and move. So again, changing the environment, the sensory load, changing the expectations, tolerating a little bit more activity from the audience. And I'm working with a group that it's an initiative to promote sensory-friendly performing arts, and what some work I've been doing with some occupational therapy graduate students. We've also been doing this work at the Science Center, and another group is working with the aquarium this year. But so the idea is that you're creating sensory-friendly performances that are designed to be more welcoming for children who have autism or other disabilities and sensory sensitivities. And how are they doing that? So again, with these sensory accommodations or principles in mind, lowering the sound level, especially for startling or loud sounds, keeping the lights on at a low level during the performance, kind of reducing strobe lights or lighting on the audience, and then kind of letting people move around and get up and down, and having spaces. I didn't talk about this as an intervention, but a space to kind of go and calm down. It's not a timeout, but it's more of a place to take a sensory break, so you can remove yourself from some of that activity and stimulation. Space for standing and movement, because we know how hard it might be to sit. Sitting alone is a difficult task for children. And then maybe as possible, you can sort of control what's going on in the broader environment. And again, these are some of the things that the Kennedy Center is doing out in Washington, D.C., and they're sort of leading some of these initiatives. And they're working with very special arts kind of nationwide to also, I think, collectively advocate for some of these kinds of activities. And then I just wanted to share, so this is the work that I did with what my graduate students did, and most of the work, but what they did is we worked with the Pacific Science Center, and so they have a page, and these are available for parents or consumers to, their sensory supports, and I'll explain what each of those are. So one of these, the resources develop tips and tools for parents, so thinking about how the Science Center can be a challenging environment and giving parents some tips to visit the Science Center at a low volume time. I know they have some, I think once or twice a year, they have like an early open event too, where they just have fewer kids in the Science Center alone, and so that's an option. And then, be thinking about, the rest is about some of the resources, but just thinking about transitions within this, exhibit to exhibit and how that might be harder. So it's giving them some heads up on here are some challenges and here are some ways that you might want to be thinking about supports. And so what the students did is they developed we call them adventure planners, but they're basically social stories for all the different exhibits. So there's some literature that supports that planning ahead and the use of these social stories can be helpful tools. So before planning a trip, you can talk to the child, use these with the child to help them understand what might be happening or understand the behavior expectation. And then they created a sensory map. So they kind of went through and they looked at the sensory load of these different exhibits, and they rated it as low, moderate, or high. And there's one with I don't know how many of you have been at the Science Center, but the Well Body Academy, where the sneeze comes out on the wall at you, and you get a little wet there. Or there's some odors too, but there's some unexpected sensory kind of stimulation that could be hard to maybe tolerate if you're not expecting it. So this, it's a way that you can steer through the Science Center and plan ahead to maybe avoid some of those places if you know they might be difficult. And then a picture schedule or a visual schedule of different things to help plan the trip. So, here we are going to the Science Center, and then we'll go to the Laser Dome, and next we will take a break. So you can, use those to again, help with some of that predictability and planning that may be useful for kids with sensory issues. And then I'll take the last couple minutes to just talk about coping skills. So I think the video clip that I showed you, it stated that even when we do provide intervention, we don't necessarily get rid of these sensory issues altogether. Sort of like, temperament, you sort of have some of these tendencies. But you can teach coping skills to recognize the sensory triggers and recognize when those internal arousal states begin to increase or signs of overstimulation, and then think about regulatory tools and strategies that can be used. And I think for kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities, part of this is that the parents are recognizing or the teachers are recognizing the sensory triggers, and then you're hoping that you're teaching the child to recognize that, and then you might be introducing and prompting the use of some of those tools with the eventual goal of them sort of self-initiating and using that. So there's sort of a scaffolded process and not the expectation that you're going to teach these coping skills and they're going to learn right away, but that it's a process and it's going to need support. And so 2 programs that could do that, there's the ALERT program. How many of you have heard of the ALERT program? A couple of you. It teaches how children and parents and teachers how to recognize arousal states and use different kinds of sensory motor strategies. And so it gives a framework, a very simple vocabulary to help children recognize and regulate their arousal states based on a car engine. So if they're just right, they're feeling like in that state of readiness. If they're running on low speed, recognizing they're running on low speed, and here are some regulatory activities we can do to get you back to just right. Or here you are on high speed, and how can you calm your body down so you can get back to just right. And this was developed for children 8 to 12, but it's really been expanded to younger children as well as older children with cognitive disabilities. So that principle and that analogy of the car engine, I think, is easy for kids to understand, and you can use it individually or in groups. And then we've also, how about the zones of regulation? Have some of you heard of the zones of regulation? So this is a flexible curriculum that uses cognitive behavioral strategies to do the same thing, to help kids recognize their internal arousal states through the different zones. Kind of blue would be moving slowly, yellow, you're kind of moving into that losing control a little bit, and then red, that's where you're angry, mad, or kind of disorganized. And so what's different about this, I think it's a sort of the next level, is you're linking sensory and emotional regulation in this one. And then we've actually done a group of with children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and what we found is that we just had to repeat things more, and it took a little bit longer. There's a lot of lessons. We didn't get through the whole lesson, but again, I think that they were responsive and the ideas worked, and that analogy is and capacity to learn self-regulation or recognize those states, it's certainly there. But I think with any population where there might be cognitive or other behavioral issues, thinking about that learning or that scaffolding or that repetition that might be needing to go alongside any of these self-regulatory kinds of programs is really important. So I just, again, wanted to introduce those also as another way to provide intervention and, teach these important coping skills that they might need as children, but that would, they're more lifelong skills that they'd want to pay attention to. So I'm going to not go through my summary because I'll just take a few questions because I see it's already 8:25, but you can kind of read that just as a recap of some of the key points. Questions?
Can I just share one thing? I'm so thrilled that you brought up the Kennedy Center. A colleague here and myself, Dr. Andrew Ryder, and I presented at the Kennedy Center to promote the arts for children with disabilities and keeping the arts in the school for our kids with special needs. And we talked a lot about their work with sensory. And we actually have a division from the Kennedy Center that we do here at the end of March that you're all welcome to participate in. And we do a lot of workshops on the SPU campus that continues to promote and talk about the different places around Seattle and areas that have the theaters. So just as long as you brought that up, I thought I'd take this opportunity to promote.
Yeah, and again, it's really about that, what do kids and families want to do? What is that quality of life? Going to the community and doing these activities that, children like to do and parents like to do with their children. I think if you have a child with special needs who have has sensory challenges or other behavioral difficulties, it's hard to do that, and you may not do it, or it may not be a successful experience. So that's what some of this is about. Other questions?
Is there any information about sensory sensitivity as it relates to sleep?
You know, yes, there is some literature that I know. I can speak to the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder literature or the prenatal alcohol exposed, that population, and I know there was a study that linked the sleep problems with the sensory problems. But I think also children with developmental disabilities may have some other more complex, maybe physiological sleep issues. So I like to think of the sensory in relation to more of the like sleep habits or bedtime habits and routines. You know, there's some ways that you can do that to affect arousal and make that routine go smoothly, but there are some, you know, significant, perhaps, again, physiological sleep problems that may be, that would need to be investigated by a physician that I think you need to understand. So I'm cautious about how we connect sensory and sleep, because sleep can be, you know, it's part of that regulatory kind of continuum, but it's definitely something that is also more specialized and deserves maybe some more specialized attention. So, other questions?
Have you noticed, I do ABA.
Right.
And what I have noticed is with like ABA and other therapies that a lot of them overlap. So a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, I do with my kids.
Mm-hmm.
So have you noticed that a lot of the therapies overlap, like speech, and then do you see change because there overlap, or is that kind of like a downfall that they're getting implemented so much in so many different ways?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, boy, there could be a lot of different answers and different opinions on this, but I think you're working with a team with a lot of these children, and so there's value to all these different approaches, and so working together so that there's consistency, which, I mean, in that respect, overlap would be a good thing, because you want to maybe respond to behaviors consistently or understand them in a consistent way. You know, if you're kind of contradicting and doing completely different approaches, I think that can be confusing and maybe not as productive. But you know, I think those are really important questions to ask, how all of the interventions together are supporting the child and not, you know, maybe, you know, competing with each other for an end goal. But I think it speaks to, there are multiple ways to reach, I think, an end goal, and any one or multiple of these different kinds of approaches might, you know, be important to consider or do all together. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah. Do you think that it's ever too much sensory? Do you think it's ever, when you like you do ABA and then you do PT and then you do OT and then you do speech, and it's all the same? And do you think it's ever too much of sensory overload kind of thing, like too much therapy?
You know, I think it could be. It's again, I think sometimes the literature says intensity of therapy matters, intensity of intervention. Like with ABA, you'll never get the intensity of occupational therapy that you get with ABA. But I think what, you know, the occupational therapy, the sensory perspective, could maybe have you think about the sensory sort of antecedents to behavior a little bit more, provide some, you know, regulatory strategies. So if you are doing some really focused behavior intervention, that child's in a better state for that. So that's where I see them linked together, and I think ideally that's, you're working toward a common goal in problem solving, but I know that is not always easy to do because people have different schedules and whatnot. So yeah.
My question is, how important is it to have an early evaluation like in a preschool setting? And then my second question is, where specifically do you send parents? How important on a scale of 1 to 10 is it that you have an early evaluation?
Well, I think if you have clear symptoms or sensory concerns, the earlier you can intervene, the better, because I think what happens if you're responding to a behavior challenge in a way that might not match maybe what the core need is or the core problem, that can cause more behavior problems or frustration, or kind of lead to some dead ends in terms of what you try, or less success. So I think in that respect, early identification is important, because it might help you reframe that behavior earlier, so that it's that neurological issue and that child's not getting labeled as bad. Or, I mean, we see kids, unfortunately, that they're asked to leave daycares because their behaviors are problematic and difficult. And so it's sort of like, if you can prevent that from happening by understanding where that behavior is stemming from, that's a good thing. Because and it's about that match too. So,
And where do you specifically refer parents? You can't just say, I would prefer not to say you just need an evaluation.
Right.
But is there a specific place you could refer the parents so that they're not like just...
Yeah, and you're coming from a daycare, so it wouldn't be like they're in a school, because if they're in a school, they could talk to the OT in the school, or the OT in an early intervention setting. But depending on the child's age, they could go through a birth to 3 program, or an early child defined screen. Those are ways to do that. Or you can just contact, again, birth to 3 centers, and then there's different clinics in the area that have occupational therapists or physical therapists that would do those kinds of evaluations. So you have to connect to that list, but you would find a list of local providers. So I'd have to look and see exactly where that link might be, and how many options you would get presented with if you did that. But you would look around for occupational therapy clinicians. And well, I guess take one last question, and then we have to wrap it up. So.
Probably not what an OT wants to hear, but is there medication that works against this?
It's interesting, a great question, because I think a lot of people who kind of seek some of these evaluations, they may be wanting to consider options before they do medication. I think that's up to the discretion of a physician and a family, and I think there's times when, depending on what the issue is, some of the sensory strategies can be very effective in relation to behavior. But there's other times where medication might be a really important part of the whole treatment package, and there's certainly sensory integration and medication. Some children, they get both of those kinds of interventions, so a behavioral and a... Pardon?
What medication would that be?
I can't speak to that, because that would not be, there's so many different medications that some children might take, so that, but again, I think some people seek these approaches as maybe alternatives to medication, but that it's really, you have to make informed decisions, and medication can be very effective with some behaviors, and both can go hand in hand. So I don't want to discount the value of either alone or together. So that's a tough question to end on. So, but again, there's some resources that I think are some of the better ones out there, where there's a lot of these tools. Sounds like this will be posted. And then just some books out there that I think, again, can be very informative and educational. For your attention.